The afternoon sun bathed Washington, D.C. in a soft golden light, as Carolyn Leavitt, 27, the youngest White House press secretary in history, sat quietly in her upscale apartment, just blocks from the White House. A small silver cross on the collar of her navy blue blazer shimmered, a quiet emblem of her faith in New Hampshire roots. Suddenly her phone rang. It was President Trump. "Caroline," he said briskly, "there's a case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians banned from praying in public. I want you to observe. Report back." His tone left no room for hesitation. Her apartment, as orderly as her reputation, reflected the discipline she brought to the podium. Papers were filed neatly, outfits pressed and lined up. She swapped out her usual ensemble for something more understated. Black pants, a crisp white shirt, and her signature blazer, always with the cross. But today wasn't just another political fire to manage. This case struck a personal chord. Within minutes, Caroline was gliding through the Capitol in her black SUV, ignoring the chatter on NPR, her mind focused. The mission was unexpected, but clear. At the courthouse, she stepped through glass doors into a chaotic scene. The air was thick, murmurs echoing through the crowd, a strange symphony of traffic cases and petty disputes unfolding alongside her arrival. She checked the time. 2:53 p.m. The religious freedom hearing was minutes away. Choosing a seat in the center row, Carolyn set down her leather bag, opened her phone, and began taking notes. Fluorescent lights bounced off the silver cross at her collar, drawing quiet attention from the people around her. But she was unaware, focused solely on the task. The courtroom was small, cluttered, and stifling. A man nearby wore a t-shirt that read, "I am king." A woman's jewelry glittered obnoxiously under the lights. Clearly, this court didn't enforce a strict dress code. Caroline took note. Then the door behind the bench opened. Judge Charles. Hargrove entered with precision, every inch of him rigid, salt and pepper hair combed back, wire-rimmed glasses sliding down a sharp nose, his robe as crisp as his posture. "All rise," came the voice of the bailiff. Caroline stood, still holding her phone, studying Hargrove carefully as he began calling cases with swift detachment. A fine here, a warning there. The process was clinical, but then Hargrove's gaze locked on her. "Miss Leavitt," he said, pausing mid-sentence. There was a faint hesitation in his otherwise cold tone. "That cross," he added, pointing to her collar, "doesn't belong here. This is a neutral space, not a platform for faith." Caroline didn't flinch. "I'm here on official duty," she replied, calm and poised. "This is a personal item, protected under the First Amendment. It violates no rules." Hargrove narrowed his eyes. "This courtroom is not a church," he snapped, gavel cracking like thunder, the air now charged with tension. The crowd turned, murmurs rising. The confrontation had begun. James Wilson, the longtime bailiff, stood near the judge's bench, his posture stiff as he tilted his head slightly, observing the tension unfold. Mrs. Thompson, the middle-aged court clerk with a severe bun and a lifetime of courtroom routine behind her, paused her typing. Her eyes shifted toward Caroline, curiosity replacing monotony. The man in the "I am king" t-shirt and the woman with the chandelier-like necklace exchanged hushed whispers, both clearly surprised that Judge Hargrove hadn't so much as glanced at them. Yet here was Caroline being singled out for a cross. Caroline stood still, her grip on her phone tightening. She realized at once, it wasn't her presence Hargrove resented. It was the symbol she wore. "Sir," she said calmly, her voice firm but respectful, "I have the right to wear this under the First Amendment." Hargrove cut her off with a sneer. "Don't lecture me on the law. Step up to the bench now." The room went silent. The collective breath of the crowd hung in the air. Caroline inhaled deeply and moved forward, the heels of her shoes tapping softly against the worn wooden floor. Her steps were poised, deliberate. The cross at her collar caught the courtroom lights, glinting like a tiny flame braving an oncoming storm. Judge Hargrove loomed from his elevated bench, his glasses low on his nose, face flushed. What are you doing here wearing that thing? Miss Levitt? He asked, his voice low, sharp as a blade. He was trying to mask his hostility with authority. I'm here on official duty, she replied. And I have the right to wear it. Her thumb subtly tapped her phone screen, activating the recording function. Hargrove slammed his gavel against the bench, the crack echoing. I've seen people like you before, thinking faith gives you license to break rules. This is my courtroom. And in here I say what's allowed. He leaned forward, eyes burning. Do you understand that this behavior constitutes contempt of court? Caroline scanned the room. The man in the flashy t-shirt, the woman with gaudy jewelry, none of them had been warned. No rules seemed to be enforced, except against her. Sir, she said steadily, I'm not disrupting anything. I'm simply observing, and my attire does not interfere. If there's a written policy banning religious symbols, I'd like to see it. A cruel smile flickered across Hargrove's face. A policy? I am the policy in this courtroom, he barked. You came in here flaunting that cross, demanding rights, and now you demand documents? He slammed the gavel again, so hard that Mrs. Thompson's fingers froze over her keyboard. The crowd murmured. An older man in the back shook his head and leaned toward his neighbor. That necklace is twice as big. Why isn't he saying anything about that? James Wilson's eyes narrowed. In 15 years of working with Judge Hargrove, he'd seen this pattern before. This wasn't about order. It was personal. Caroline steadied herself. She knew arguing further would only provoke more hostility. If I've violated a rule, I have the right to a clear explanation, she said, subtly adjusting her phone to ensure it continued recording. Hargrove leaned forward again. Here's your explanation. I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court. The gavel came down with finality. Gasps echoed through the room. Mrs. Thompson looked up, concern creasing her face. 500? A young woman whispered. For a cross? The man in the t-shirt chuckled, but stopped abruptly when Hargrove glared at him. You'll pay the fine before you leave, Hargrove snapped. Let this be a lesson. This is a courtroom, not a church, and it's not your stage. He sat back, self-satisfied, as though he'd won a battle. Caroline remained still, her eyes locked with his. I understand your ruling, she said evenly, but I have a question. Why is no one else being fined for visible symbols or statements? In their attire? Hargrove's face flushed deeper. His grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles whitened. Don't change the subject, he barked. You're the only one bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom. That's the difference. Caroline nodded slightly. That was all she needed to hear. He wasn't just biased. He was hostile to her faith. And now she had it recorded. Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, but her hands trembled. In over a decade beside, this judge, she had rarely seen such a display of power wielded so harshly over something so small, and yet so meaningful. James Wilson stood near the bench, arms crossed, his eyes settling on Caroline with a flicker of empathy. He'd watched Judge Hargrove oversee hundreds of cases, but this was different. This fixation on a young woman with a small cross on her collar, it felt personal. The crowd's whispers were growing louder, and despite the posted signs, a few spectators stealthily raised their phones, beginning to film. Caroline stood motionless, her phone still in hand, mind racing. She understood. Clearly now, this wasn't just about a fine, it was an opportunity, a moment to reveal something bigger. Are you done, sir? She asked, her voice soft but cutting. Hargrove blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her calmness. Not yet, he snapped. You'll pay the fine and I'll move on with the session. Sit down. But Caroline didn't sit. Instead, she stepped closer to the bench and placed her hand gently on its edge. Her eyes never wavered from his. I'll pay, she said, her voice low but laced with quiet power. But we're not done here. Hargrove smirked again, but it faltered. Caroline Levitt stood firm at the defendant's stand, the silver cross at her collar glinting defiantly under the courtroom lights. Hargrove, red-faced and triumphant just moments earlier, still gripped his gavel like a weapon. But the room had shifted. The energy had changed. The crowd leaned in. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had stopped typing altogether, her eyes darting nervously between the two. James Wilson tilted his head ever so slightly, as if sensing something was about to erupt. Hargrove broke the silence. "Did you hear me, Miss Levitt? $500. Payable today. Sit down." He slammed the gavel. Still, Caroline didn't move. She drew in a breath, calm and centered. "Before I sit, sir, I need to clarify a few things. For the record." Hargrove frowned again, visibly irritated. "The record? You've got no right to demand anything in my courtroom," he said, but his voice wavered. Caroline gave a faint smile, not smug, just steady, the kind of smile from someone who knew exactly where they stood. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small gold credential card, holding it up for all to see. "I'm Caroline Levitt, White House Press Secretary." Under President Donald Trump. A stunned silence hit the courtroom. The man in the I Am King shirt dropped his jaw. The woman with the oversized necklace leaned in to whisper to her attorney. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. Hargrove's hand froze in midair. Caroline continued, unwavering. "But what you don't know, Your Honor, is that I don't just talk. I know the law. And I know when it's being bent." "That doesn't change the fact," Hargrove began, but she stepped closer, her voice slicing through the air. "Your rules," she said evenly, "or your bias." The room fell still. "I'm here on presidential directive to observe a religious liberties case, Christians suing for the right to pray in public spaces. This cross," she said, gesturing to the silver gleam at her throat, "is my protected right. My First Amendment right." She leaned in slightly, her voice crisp. "You find me for wearing it, so tell me, Judge, do you know what the law actually says?" Hargrove's face reddened, then paled. Caroline pressed on, her tone precise. "Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah, 1993. The Supreme Court ruled that banning religious expression without compelling justification is unconstitutional." She let that hang in the air before finishing. "So, Judge, do you have a compelling reason, or is it just that you don't like it?" Gasps filled the room. Phones were lifted higher now. Rules be damned. Hargrove opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, her fingers poised midair above the keyboard. James Wilson stood a little straighter, the ghost of a smile forming on his lips. Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger. "You fined me $500 for contempt," she said, "but take a look around." She turned, gesturing to the man in the graphic t-shirt. "His shirt violates your stated dress code." Then to the woman nearby. "Her necklace is louder than anything I'm wearing. But you said nothing to them." She turned back to Hargrove. "Only my cross offended you. Only my faith drew your punishment. That's not enforcing the law, that's targeting." Hargrove's hands trembled, the gavel hanging loosely in his grip. "You're slandering me," he muttered weakly. Caroline raised her phone. "No, sir. I'm recording you. I've recorded everything from the moment you summoned me to now, and just before I stepped up, I sent a message to the White House." Silence. Her eyes never left his. "This won't disappear into courtroom shadows. Bias in a robe is still bias, and now it's on the record." Caroline's voice rang out, unwavering. "I've reported this injustice to the White House. You want to find me? Fine. But this doesn't end here." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Someone shouted, "She's right." Another clapped briefly before James Wilson silenced them with a sharp glance. Still, the atmosphere had changed. The tide had turned. Judge Hargrove looked panicked, grasping at what remained of his authority. "Miss Levitt, I can withdraw the fine," he stammered, voice trembling as he banged the gavel with none of the force from before. No need to escalate, but Caroline stood firm, her eyes locked on his. "No, sir," she said, her tone cool and steady. "Withdrawing it because of who I am only proves your bias. The issue isn't me, it's how you run this court." The room froze. "I demand a review of all cases from the past 6 months. Every fine involving religious symbols. And I recommend mandatory First Amendment training for all court personnel, including you." The courtroom exploded. An older man stood and clapped, calling, "Out." "That's right," a young woman in the front row whispered. "Who is she?" "Amazing." Mrs. Thompson, now typing at a frantic pace, couldn't hide the gleam in her eyes. She knew she was documenting history. James Wilson smiled quietly, the respect on his face unmistakable. Judge Hargrove collapsed into his chair, his face ashen, hands trembling around the gavel. He looked up at Caroline, not as a defendant, but as someone far more dangerous, someone in control. "You think I'm just a spokesperson?" Carolyn said, her voice low but powerful. "I've stood beside President Trump through lawsuits, press attacks, election battles, and policy wars. I taught myself the law to defend him, and now I'm using it to defend myself and others." She stepped forward, laid her White House credentials gently on the bench, and took a single step back. "You just made a very big mistake, Judge Hargrove." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The room erupted in applause, scattered but growing. Mrs. Thompson typed faster than ever, her fingers dancing across the keys like they were preserving the birth of a movement. James Wilson stepped closer to the bench, eyes full of admiration. Caroline stood perfectly still, the silver cross on her collar gleaming like a standard raised high. It was no longer just a symbol of faith. It was her banner of victory. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the courthouse steps. Caroline Levitt paused at the glass doors, checking her phone. The recording had already been sent to the White House along with a brief message to the president's senior advisor. "Judge fined me for the cross. Handled it. Next steps?" She knew this wasn't just personal anymore. It was bigger. It was fuel for a broader fire, and a political rallying cry that could electrify the base. Inside, the buzz still echoed. The older man in the back turned to his neighbor. "I've never seen anyone silence a judge like that," the young woman, with her boyfriend, whispered, wide-eyed. "She's the White House press secretary. That was incredible." Mrs. Thompson rushed to print the session transcript, her hands still shaking as she processed what had just unfolded. James Wilson, already outside, was on the phone. "You won't believe this," he said. "A young woman just dismantled Hargrove in open court." The story spread like wildfire. Caroline hadn't even reached her car when her phone exploded with notifications. On X, the hashtag #CrossInCourt was trending. She opened the app and saw the first viral tweet. "Judge fines White House press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She destroys him with constitutional law, leaves him speechless. Cross in court." 10 minutes later, the feed was flooded. "Who is she? This is what strength looks like. Hargrove's done. Proof the system is biased against Christians. Thank you, Caroline Levitt." Caroline gave a small smile. The wave was building, and she was ready to ride it. At 4 p.m., President Trump himself weighed in. "Caroline Levitt, my amazing spokesperson, just taught a leftist judge a lesson on religious freedom. Legal genius, we won't let them suppress faith." Within 30 minutes, the post had over 50,000 retweets. Conservative media seized the moment. Fox News led with, "White House press secretary faces off with judge over cross and wins big." Minutes later, Caroline's phone lit up again. Trump's senior advisor was on the line. "You did great," he said, voice glowing with pride. "The president wants this amplified. Prep a statement." Caroline looked toward the courthouse behind her, then ahead to the cameras, the headlines, and the political momentum waiting to ignite. This was only the beginning. Meanwhile, Judge Charles Hargrove sat alone in his chambers, the dim light casting long shadows over his pale face. Behind the bench, the once imposing figure looked small, almost fragile. His phone buzzed nonstop, calls from the D.C. Judicial Council, reporters, even old colleagues. He silenced it, unable to face any of them. Hands trembling, he clutched a mug of cold coffee. The courtroom clash with Caroline Levitt hadn't just humiliated him, it was now echoing across the city like a siren. He muttered under his breath, "She's just a girl. How did this happen?" But deep down he knew the truth. He hadn't just collided with a woman. He'd collided with a movement. Back in the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson couldn't hold back any longer. She picked up her phone and called a friend at a local paper. Her voice, usually gentle, now carried a quiet resolve. "I've worked with Hargrove for 12 years, she said. "He always targets religious symbols, especially Christian ones. That girl today, she was right. I have notes to prove it." She pulled open a drawer and retrieved a small, worn notebook filled with dated entries, case after case. People fined for crosses. Muslim women warned for hijabs. Meanwhile, slogan T-shirts and flashy jewelry passed without comment. She knew the risk. But after what she'd seen, silence wasn't an option. Elsewhere in the courthouse, James Wilson gathered with a few fellow bailiffs in the break room, recounting the scene with raw emotion. "I've counted over 20 fines this year alone, all for religious symbols," he said. Meanwhile, someone walks in with a vulgar T-shirt and Hargrove just laughs. Levitt exposed what we all knew, but never said out loud. A colleague nodded. "This has to go public. I'll call the press." By 5 p.m., a Channel 7 reporter stood outside the courthouse live on air. Today, White House Press Secretary Caroline Levitt was fined $500 for wearing a cross in court, she reported. She fought back, and now the city is buzzing. Online, Guar's cross in court surged past 100,000 mentions on X. People shared their own stories. "He fined me $200 last year for a prayer badge. Saw him scold a mom over a cross necklace in a custody hearing." A short clip from inside the courtroom hit the web. Caroline holding up her White House credentials, her voice calm and commanding. The video went viral, racking up over 1 million views within hours. Caroline, meanwhile, sat in her parked car on a quiet street corner, watching the headlines explode on her phone. She dialed her husband, a quiet, grounded businessman. Her voice was steady, but excitement flickered beneath the surface. "Hey, I just shut down a judge. This is going to be huge." He laughed, half proud, half in awe. "You always pull off the impossible. Just stay safe." She nodded, ended the call, and opened her email. A message from the president's office blinked at the top of her inbox. "Prep for a press conference tonight. We're turning this into a win." Back in his office, Hargrove turned on the evening news. His own face flashed across the screen under the bold headline, "Judge faces backlash after fining press secretary for wearing cross." He turned it off, hands trembling. The Judicial Council had already called, demanding a full explanation by morning. 30 years of authority, now teetering. And all because of a 27-year-old and a simple silver cross. The next morning, the D.C. Judicial Council office buzzed with energy. News of the Levitt-Hargrove showdown had swept through Washington, prompting the council to launch an emergency investigation. At the head of the inquiry, veteran investigator Linda Martinez stood before a long table, covered in files from Hargrove's courtroom. Her team had been at work since 6 a.m., and pressure was mounting fast. "We've got 48 hours to deliver a full report," Linda said, voice firm. "Find everything, every fine, every warning, anything tied to religious expression." Backwas. At the White House, Caroline was already preparing for that night's press conference. She replayed the courtroom footage, reviewing every moment. Another email flew off to the president's advisor. "I've pulled over 300 posts from X, dozens claiming similar experiences. Let's push this hard." Her phone buzzed again. Messages from reporters, lawyers, and supporters poured in. One law student wrote, "You inspired me. Hargrove fined my mom for wearing a cross once." Caroline smiled softly. This was no longer just her fight. It was everyone's. At the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson arrived at the investigation room, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "I've tracked Hargrove for 12 years, she told Linda, voice shaking but resolute. "He's always gone after religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, anything visible. But he let crude T-shirts and flashy chains slide." Linda flipped through the notebook. Dozens of dates, incidents, names. September 14th, 2024. Man fined $300 for cross necklace. October 20th, 2024. Muslim woman fined $200 for hijab deemed disruptive. Linda's brow furrowed. "This is gold," she whispered. "Thank you." James Wilson arrived, next handing Linda a handwritten statement. "I've been a bailiff here 15 years, he said. I've watched Hargrove fine people for religious symbols 3 times more than anyone else. This isn't new. It's just finally been seen." Violations stacked up fast. James Wilson had once counted 5 fines for people wearing crosses in a single day, yet 3 others with vulgar t-shirts walked away unnoticed. Linda Martinez scribbled furiously, her team cross-referencing court records. A pattern emerged. Over the past year, 70% of religious symbol violations had targeted Christians. The average fine? $200, nearly double the penalty for other dress code issues. Meanwhile, Charles Hargrove sat in his home office, facing the Judicial Council via Zoom. His voice trembled, hands cradling his head. "I didn't mean to be biased," he muttered. Linda spoke clearly, presenting the data. "Mr. Hargrove, you find individuals wearing crosses 80% more harshly than others. How do you explain that?" He fell silent, eyes lowered. Caroline's voice echoed in his mind, her sharp arguments about the First Amendment, her refusal to back down. "I thought I was keeping order," he whispered. "I didn't realize." By noon, Linda's preliminary report was complete. "This goes beyond Hargrove," she told the council. "We found 3 other judges with mild patterns, but Hargrove is the clearest case. Blatant bias against religious expression, especially Christianity." The council acted swiftly, ordering Hargrove's immediate suspension pending final review. News of it broke online, and within minutes, Dameron Cross in court surged again on X. Hargrove suspended. Caroline Levitt shakes the system. One popular account posted, "Trump's legal genius just won again." At 6 p.m., Caroline stood before a mirror in the White House briefing room. The silver cross on her blazer gleamed. Trump entered, clapping her shoulder. "You made me proud, Caroline," he said. "Tonight we show them religious freedom is untouchable." She stepped to the podium as cameras flashed. "Yesterday I was fined for wearing a cross, not because I was wrong, but because a judge thought he was above the law," she declared. "I stood up not just for myself, but for anyone ever treated unfairly for their faith." Reporters fired questions. She answered them with legal precision, citing constitutional law and social media data. Hargrove watched from home, hand trembling as he muted the TV. His inbox overflowed. Colleagues distancing themselves, reporters seeking comment, but what hit hardest were testimonies from people he once trusted. Thompson. Wilson. He opened his laptop and searched Church of the Lukumi Babaluai, the ruling Caroline had cited. "She was right," he admitted softly. "I was wrong." For the first time in 3 decades, Charles Hargrove felt small. He called the council. "I'm resigning," he said, voice hoarse. "But I want to help fix this." The next day, Hargrove appeared at a council meeting, no longer in robes. "I didn't see my own bias," he told them, eyes red. Caroline Levitt opened my eyes. "I want to join the training. I don't want anyone to repeat my mistakes." Linda Martinez nodded. His shift could prove useful. The media exploded again. Some mocked his change of heart. Others said at least he admitted it, rare enough in Washington. Back in her White House office, Caroline opened an email from Linda. "Hargrove resigned. Agreed to help. You changed him." She looked at her cross in the mirror and smiled. The Christian group she'd originally come to support now felt like a footnote. What happened next was far bigger. In just 4 days, D.C. was different. New regulations rolled out. A council memo read, "Thank you, Ms. Levitt. No more bans on religious symbols unless they caused genuine disruption. All staff, judges to clerks, would now receive mandatory First Amendment training." Linda stood before the council. "The Hargrove case proves it. Transparency and education are non-negotiable." Outside the courthouse, a new plaque was installed. "Religious freedom, a right beyond violation." The hashtag still trended. DC changes law thanks to Caroline Levitt. At the first training session, Hargrove stood before dozens of court staff. "I thought I was fair," he said, voice rough. "But I was wrong. Caroline Levitt taught me to look in the mirror. Don't let your bias blind you." In the front row sat Mrs. Thompson, now heading the court's transparency program. James Wilson, training new bailiffs, added, "We're the eyes and ears. If we see injustice, we speak." That week, Caroline hung her $500 fine receipt in a glass frame on her office wall. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. One voice, backed by truth, can shift the system. Trump walked in again. "You're a star, Caroline. Religious freedom crowd loves you. So do I." He laughed. "We just won big. Keep going." She nodded, preparing for her next speech at a Virginia rally where thousands waited. What started as an ordinary court visit had become a national spark. The ripple spread fast. Texas, Florida, and Ohio began reviewing their own court policies. The Texas governor tweeted, "Thanks to Caroline Levitt for defending faith. Texas stands with her." In Florida, lawyers filed for similar training. On X, people posted photos of their crosses, hijabs, and religious bracelets. "My freedom, no one can ban it." Caroline read the posts, pride rising. She hadn't planned this, but the fire had caught. In Virginia, 5,000 people stood waving banners. "I just wanted to do my job," she told the roaring crowd. "But when a judge fined me for my faith, I couldn't stay silent. This victory isn't mine alone. It's all of ours." The cross on her collar caught the light. An image that spread everywhere, labeled "Symbol of Resilience." Back in D.C., reform solidified. Mrs. Thompson monitored records. James trained the next generation of court officers. Linda sent Caroline a letter. "You didn't just change Hargrove, you changed the system." Charles Hargrove, now a volunteer, instructor, stood in a training room. "I was wrong, but Caroline Levitt showed me justice must be blind to bias." Later that evening, Trump called again. "You're my warrior, Caroline. Keep it up." She smiled, standing on the White House balcony, the cross in her hand gleaming in the setting sun. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a signal fire, a symbol of defiance and change. Then a new message arrived. The Judicial Council had formally invited her to lead a national reform commission. She smiled. The journey from one fine had turned into a revolution. She had proven one person, one belief, could shake the system and light a path for millions.